All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for another webinar in our Cybersecurity Data Assured program in partnership with the New Hampshire SBDC and the New Hampshire Tech Alliance. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to partner to bring free cybersecurity programming to small businesses throughout the state of New Hampshire. And from the Alliance's perspective, we are especially thrilled to be able to position our members as subject matter experts and let them share their knowledge with you. This initiative will continue to provide these web-based training programs. Keep an eye out for the content that is being released to support these programs. And we will pick up where we left off next month and continue focusing on how to protect your business from cyber threats. So today you're going to learn about some trends in cyber fraud, and you'll be equipped with the tools that will help protect your liquidity from fraudsters. Just a note and a bit of housekeeping, please feel free to save your questions for the end. You can enter them in chat sort of as they arise, but Karen will be covering a lot of information today, and I think it'll move a bit more smoothly if we can save the questions for the end. We are thrilled to welcome the team from People's United Bank. I have tremendous respect for their entire team. And Peles is a driving force for the Alliance. They serve as one of our tech ecosystem champions. So really, they are at the table helping us make decisions around programming and really helping to drive the direction of the Alliance as a whole. I am going to introduce board member Dave Janelle, who serves as the Senior Vice President of Commercial Banking at People's United Bank. And he will be moderating the panel today. So Dave will take us through. Again, save those questions for the end, and we'll be hearing from me a bit later in the program. So Dave, thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie. So Julie mentioned I'm actually a director of New Hampshire Tech Alliance, and then my day job is a commercial lender with People's United Bank. So for all of you that don't know who we are, we're a regional bank in the Northeast with operations from Maine down to New York. And if you haven't heard yet, we have some exciting things going on in our world. We'll be merging with M&T Bank. And when you put the two banks together, that should happen in the fourth quarter of this year. And you put the two banks together, we will be an organization that will cover Maine down to Virginia and Washington, D.C., a $200 billion bank, sizable bank. And we'll have 1,100 branches throughout our network and cover 12 states. So you'll be hearing a lot more about our partnership as becoming part of the family with M&T in the near future. So my role as a commercial lender is lending money to businesses and helping them grow. And as part of that, I'm also the quarterback on the commercial banking relationship with those clients. And to deliver the full bank products and services, I partner with my colleagues, and we have one of them here today with us, Mr. Todd Ferrucci, who heads up our treasury management for the bank in New Hampshire. And Todd partners with our customers to develop treasury management solutions, and this is how you interact with the bank, how you collect money, how you make payments, and track all of that information. Also, Todd has certain products and services to protect your accounts and prevent fraud. So Todd will be talking a little bit about that a little later. So the topic that we have today on cybercrime and fraud is very timely given the visibility of some ransomware cyber attacks that has happened throughout the US that have disrupted the fuel supply and food supply across the US. These are very visible things, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, as you're soon going to find out. As Karen, our expert here in this area, she's going to show you some of her understanding of this industry and share some best practices. So I'm really excited to have her as a resource and share her knowledge with you. Now, Karen, I want to get this right. I'm going to read a little bit here. Karen has a very interesting title. I love this stuff. She is Vice President of Financial Crimes and Fraud Intelligence. How cool is that? I mean, so she's in charge of all the fraud prevention and detection strategies for the bank, as well as heads up the fraud prevention ops group. I kind of picture that as like ninjas in the background or something.
We are. That's exactly what we are, Dave.
So she's actively involved in ACFE and IAFCI and holds positions on the American Bankers Association's Fraud Advisory Board. And today she'll be shedding some light on how and what happens when fraud is attempted within the banking system. So I'm going to get started here, and we're going to start a PowerPoint presentation for you and turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Dave. So I hope not to disappoint with my ninja introduction. That's some pretty good intro. I actually think I should hire you for all my gigs. How about that? But thank you. And Dave, I appreciate we'll be navigating the slides for me just for just more of technical ease on our end. So I guess moving forward, we could move to the next slide. And I think it was the first one was about People's United, which you touched on. So we can move right into takeaways. So again, just not to read directly off the slide, but my aspect really is to discuss some of the major threats that we have in the payment landscape, really targeting businesses as well as consumers. And although some of the material may seem more specific to cyber network hygiene, really the end game is always the same. And it's that to trick people into sending some money. So here and there, I will obviously ask Todd to jump in and discuss some ways that we could help from the banking side as well. So moving forward, let's say we have our B2B landscape, always great to start with some stats. So 81% of businesses were targets of payment fraud, and this is before the pandemic. So I'd venture to believe that this has changed dramatically. And this number is actually, I would assume, greater because it's based just on those who have detected it. So I wouldn't be too facetious to think that that should be at least 100%. 75% BEC scam victims, again, is probably underreported. And as you can see, check fraud is still very prevalent and high at 77, pretty high number. And so naturally, the increase in the new threats with COVID and the pandemic have emerged from the working from home environment as well, that allows us even some more things to think of. So moving on to really discuss the fraud threats facing businesses, starting with the traditional, as you can see, there's really no limits here. We got a lot of bullets going on, but nothing new here with the insider fraud. But with the new remote environment, clearly data sharing and internal information theft really should be top of mind as an imminent threat. Counterfeit checks still very prevalent, which we'll get into, and then scams. If it's too good to be true, then it is. I'm going to leave the probably out of it. It just is. Now moving to the COVID related. We all know KYC with knowing your customers. We've kind of exhausted that throughout the years, but really KYV needs to really be brought into the attention, and that's knowing your vendors. So the amount of synthetic businesses that are out there, which is really just fraudulent businesses that are spun up for sake of just defrauding customers, is really becoming an issue, and the COVID environment magnetized that substantially. And then we have, brick and mortars that you have to move to digital in order to stay relevant, which means moving to e-commerce. That comes with its own challenges, as well as working from home, which we'll touch on. Cyber, again, I won't go through everything because the rest of the presentation will explain that. But then also just public information sharing. So we will go through how easy it is for fraudsters to perpetrate certain types of fraud. So I just ask, please don't overshare and don't give them any more information publicly with the amount of information they could already obtain. So moving on to a really significant problem in the fraud world and in the postal industry, but until you're victimized, you probably aren't even aware this is occurring. So you could actually see in the upper left-hand corner, these are actually robbers that are robbing a U.S. postal mailbox, and on the right, you have you can see the forceful entry of this mailbox with the sign of bringing the mail inside. And then there's a law enforcement officer that's showing exactly how they're perpetrating this type of fraud. So here we are talking about cyber hygiene, and we have boots on the ground using minimal technology to really start this fraudulent game. It's cheap, it's easy, it's a fast way for fraudsters to get hands on business account data. You think about the checks that are in there, your routing, your account number, the ranges of your check, and who you're doing business with, so that they can easily social engineer. And so moving on to the next slide, it just goes to show, again, you don't have to have a computer science degree to become a hacker or a fraudster. You just need simple tools like a Gatorade bottle covered with mousetrap glue, or belts with duct tape with the sticky side sticking out. And you can see that piece of mail up in the upper left-hand corner with that rat tape glue on it, and how easily it could just come out of the mailbox. And so moving on, going through some of these tactics. Okay, well, this is a problem, Karen, but what can a fraudster really do with this? Well, touching base, as I mentioned, on checks itself, you have the routing, you have the account number. There's so much fraud that could have happened with that. And people could just pay their bills using your account information, just because there's no real name check in this 2021 industry for that ACH rails. Counterfeit checks, not just counterfeit where, okay, I see what your check looks like and I'm going to produce more, but they actually alter the checks that you make to your vendor that they steal out of these mailboxes. So you might be paying, a significant vendor, we'll say $50,000 for, we'll say computer services. I changed that, the payee, and now it's my check. Unfortunately, you don't even realize that this happened until your customer is calling you asking where the payment is. And then social engineering, again, not just your bank, but your vendors. So you have mailing addresses, you have business names in this mail. Do you mail out invoices? Well, if you do, and I obtain that, now I know your customer, their information, their invoice number. Now I could facilitate a BEC scam easily, calling them with that information that I just collected, pretending to be you, and then provide them my bank info for them to wire their payment change to me, again, without understanding that this is actually happening until sometime later. So what can businesses do to prevent this? So I'll have Todd jump in here, but generally speaking, we have positive pay, which is very simple. ACH checks and payee positive pay I'm still stunned by how many businesses don't know that this exists, or just don't feel that they need it, again, until unfortunately they have fraud perpetrated on them. But then also simple things where just, if you are using physical mail, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, but avoid the scheduled batches of mail drops. So don't go to the same mailbox every Thursday at noon and dump all your invoices and your checks. Go into the post office, hand it to the post office worker. They're very aware of the type of fraud that's happening. They won't shy away from taking your mail, and also just monitor what is going on with your account, the checks that are clearing, just to reduce the liability for you. There is a misconception that, banks have this empty pot of fraudulent insurance, which does not really exist. And at that point, if you do not detect the fraud within a certain time range, then that liability can come to you. So you don't want to fall into that. So Todd, if you don't mind, I'll pass to you here if you want to jump in with some services that Peles could use to just help in these types of scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen, and thank you. Thank you for setting the backdrop. And certainly, when this subject comes up in conversation I have with clients, many times clients, to your point, Karen, will say, this is not going to impact me. I really don't have a need for this. I only issue X amount of checks per month. I don't have a ton of volume. But lo and behold, it touches almost every client that I do business with. And in fact, it's ironic, and hopefully you don't think I'm making this story up. Literally an hour before I got on this webinar today, I had a client who had 3 fraudulent checks presented on their account to an individual that they have no business relationship with. And now they have to, go into overdrive to protect the integrity and the liquidity in their accounts. So as both Dave and Karen mentioned, there are services that the banks have developed, and we're not the only bank who offer these services. If you're banking with any bank of any significant size, these are all services that are readily available to you. There's a couple of different fraud prevention services in place. There's check positive pay, there's ACH positive pay, and then ACH debit blocks and filters. So I'll briefly describe how each service works and the benefits of each. And I think I would ask all of you to kind of equate this to a cheap insurance policy, right? Like we all have car insurance and we all hope we don't get in a car accident, but we put insurance in place to cover us if in fact we are involved in an accident. This is something similar. These services are not required, but they're strongly and highly recommended. You know, and there are some liability concerns if in fact there is any fraud perpetrated on your account. The banks will do everything in their power to recover those funds for you. But in some instances, depending on the situation and the timing of when the fraud takes place, we may not be able to recover those funds. So check positive pay is a service that would allow us to understand the checks that you have issued on your account in advance of them being presented. So every time you did a check run, you could either send us a direct transmission of a check file, or through many online banking platforms, you can upload that information through your online banking platform that you subscribe to through your bank. That file would contain typically the check number, the dollar amount of the check, the date of the check issue, and in some instances, who the check was issued to. And that's called payee positive pay. So what happens is when the checks are presented to the bank for payment, we're going to review the file that you sent to us to the check that's being presented to make certain that it's legitimate. If that check is not on that check file, the bank then would contact you and tell you, hey, we have a check being presented for X amount of dollars to Dave Janelle. We don't have that check on the issue file. Is this legitimate? So it does give you an opportunity to review any checks that are being presented on your account that you have not issued, or you have told us, or you have not told us that you've issued that. So this does a number of things for you. It protects you against anyone essentially getting their hands on your checks and counterfeiting checks and making them payable to a third party or a fraudster. And it also allows you to have checks paid that were legitimate that you forgot to send us an issue file for. So these tools work very, very well. If and when you do subscribe to this type of solution with your bank, if in fact there was any type of loss on your account and these services were in place, then the bank essentially assumes liability for those check losses if we paid a check that you did not tell us you issued or you did not want paid. ACH positive pay works in a very similar fashion. ACH, for all of you who may not know what an ACH transaction is, it's essentially the electronic movement of money. There's a network called NACHA, the National Automated Clearinghouse Network, that essentially routes all these electronic payments. So an example Karen had brought up earlier is if someone stole a check from you, they theoretically can go online and pay their own credit card bill with your banking information, right? So a lot of us as normal consumers pay our credit card bills right through American Express's website or Capital One's website. We enter in our banking information and then they debit our account, our own personal consumer account for that payment. So in some instances, we've had fraudsters get a hold of commercial business accounts and make payments to the parking authority of New York City, to pay outstanding outstanding parking tickets. I've seen all sorts of crazy scams. ACH positive pay works in a way in which whenever a debit is attempted on your account, again, you would be notified of that debit. We would detail to you what that transaction was related to, and then you can make a determination as to whether you wanted to authorize that payment or not. You also have the ability to pre-authorize certain vendors. So for example, many of you are probably working with a payroll company. Payroll companies will come into your account on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. You don't want to be bothered with basically authorizing them each and every time to come into your account because you already have a pre-existing business relationship with them. You would have the ability to authorize them as an authorized vendor. So when they come into your account, the bank would recognize them as already being approved and it would allow that transaction to take place. So we've seen all sorts of crazy scams. I won't steal Karen's thunder, but I'll share two very brief examples with you. And these stories, some of them are a little bit dated, but nonetheless, it illustrates how creative some folks are. One scam that I had, well, I won't say the pleasure of being involved with, but it was kind of neat to see how it all played out, was I was working with a very well-known college or university in our general vicinity. Their name will not be told to protect their privacy, but out in front of a building that they were erecting on campus, many times they'll say construction provided by ABC Construction, right? So they're building this dormitory on campus, and ABC Construction is the builder of that particular dormitory. This college got a call from someone purporting to be from ABC Construction and saying, hey, we've just changed banks. Our payment instructions have changed. Our next progress payment on the construction of the dormitory is due in 30 days. Can you please remit payment to this new address, right? So, the person who received that phone call said, well, that makes sense. We know we're doing business with ABC Construction. And sure enough, they sent a very, very large payment off to this particular vendor. And unfortunately, that vendor never received that payment because it went to the fraudsters' accounts. And this particular university was out a significant sum of money. So I guess one of the messages you'll hear us leave you with today is always be aware of whenever someone calls you to change payment instructions. Verify, double verify, go over the top to make certain that those instructions are in fact legitimate. The second brief story I'll share with you regarding a check that was essentially replicated. This was a manufacturer I did business with, and they were, they paid their employees weekly, and one of their employees also participated in a weekly card game, a poker game, on Friday nights. And sure enough, he had a bad day in the poker game, and he legitimately lost his paper paycheck in this particular poker game. Well, that check was now in the hands of someone he didn't really have any type of relationship with. And this individual then took that check and essentially fraudulently produced multiple checks on this business's account. So I guess there's a lot of different ways people have the ability to get your check information. So always be cognizant that that information is out there. Whether you think it is or not, it's out there, and people do have the ability to get their hands on it. The one last thing I'll leave you with, and then I'll turn it back to Karen, is one thing you will also may want to work with your commercial insurance broker on is seeing what, if any, cyber insurance you have in place. So I know a lot of my clients have now worked into their insurance policies a rider that will cover them for account takeover schemes or schemes that allowed people to infiltrate their computer network. So that's something that you may want to keep in mind if and when you have conversations with your insurance brokers to see if that insurance exists on your commercial insurance account. So Karen, I'll turn that back over to you. I may interject down the line, but I think the rest of the presentation will hit on many of the themes I just chatted about.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a fantastic couple stories, actually, because it goes to show it's not just your employees that you have to be aware of. It's unfortunately who your employees actually fraternize with of information of your business that could possibly get in the wrong hands. And another thing to touch base on that Todd just mentioned is most people also, when they do have positive pay for ACH or checks, they set it and forget it, which is exactly what the idea is, where, okay, if it's doing its job, it's doing its job. But something that could really behoove you as a business owner is really checking the returns and the rejects of the items that do not present because they are fraudulent. And I say that because yes, the positive pay is doing its job, that's great, but it gives you a transparency and insight into if your business is being under attack, like for example, a substantial amount of counterfeit checks. Even though you have positive pay, you are aware now that your business information is out there in the wild, as they call it, in which then, okay, they're not successfully facilitating fraud through checks because you have positive pay. But I mean, I beg to differ that they won't try to substantiate fraud in a different way. And so it just gives you insight if you are being a target in one channel, that unfortunately you may end up getting defrauded in a different way. And also I do have to give some credit to the USPS because they are highly engaged in that mail theft, and they're already working out changing equipment and a bunch of other different tactics to prevent that activity too. I feel like I owe them some apology on my mail fraud. But so moving now from old fraud that is still happening, there's still a quick look at present more digital risk for the business. That was the compromises that was just on the screen before. So I won't spend too much time on it because we're going to get to that anyway. So business email compromise, which everybody really knows now, but Todd made a great point that BEC scams and BEC that we hear constantly in the mail, in the news, is really referencing on the change of payment information through email. But to Todd's point now, if they use phones, they use letters, there's many different tactics. So it's not just email you have to be wary of. But for this sake, I will speak specifically about the BEC scams because there's different ways that you could actually prevent this type of fraud. So generally, you know, this either is when your vendor's email was compromised or spoofed. Unfortunately, you send funds to a fraudster, or that your email was compromised or spoofed, and then you receive instructions from a fraudster. Either way, both of these scenarios are referencing somewhat of a man in the email, a man in the middle, where a criminal gains access to the email in one way or another and is tricking the business into initiating the wire. So Dave, if you could actually back up one slide to the business email compromise for the timeline on the bottom. So step one is really to identify the target, which we actually just went out of. It could be as simple as, okay, well, you're going to be my target now because I received a bunch of your mail. And then step two is the grooming, or really the reconnaissance. So this is where, you know, it could take anywhere from weeks to months, but I'm somewhere in this middle of your email compromise or your email conversations where I'm learning the cadence of your emails, I'm learning the verbiage, who you speak to, how often, so that I can initiate step three and perpetrate to be you and or a vendor or customer trying to attack you, of that exchange of information of, again, that changing payment instructions, in which then step four, that wire transfer initiates. And exactly to what Todd mentioned before, typically for a BEC scam, you have to have within 24 hours, you have to be aware of it in order to really get your money back. Once you start bridging from 48 hours into 72 hours, it's almost virtually impossible to get the money back. And reason being is because there's either a substantial amount of endpoints that this money is being laundered through, but the majority of time it's also going to a nefarious country, which isn't really up and up on their government ethics. And in order to get the money back, it is virtually impossible. So moving on to the fraud email types. So how does this really happen? The percentages of this might be a little skewed. This is from, I believe, 2019, and obviously the world has changed a lot since then. But you know, 75% reply to spoofing. I think we're familiar with it. The from name, the address field, and the reply to appears to be of an executive, for example. But the reply to address is actually an imposter's, and we'll get into that. The spoof name, it's simple, it's easy, it happens often, where the executive in the from field appears to be the email address, but it actually is going to an outside entity. For example, I could be Karen.Boyer@Peles@Gmail, and at first glance, you know, depending on the font you have on your email, you just see the @Peles, you don't realize it's actually going to an external Gmail account, which would be a bit more obvious that you shouldn't be corresponding to this. This person probably isn't who they say they are as a business owner. And then we have a spoof sender, and then lookalike domains. I think the lookalike domains at 2% is a bit underreported, but we'll get to that. But Usually 1 and 3 are really in the crux of the email. We'll show some examples of that, but you most likely can't detect it just by reading the email itself. So you have to kind of dig deeper. So moving on to the deeper dive of that on the next slide. So really you could determine a lot from your email headers. And I know it sounds a little bit technical, but it's really a lot easier than most people think. I say it's easy as 1, 2, 3 because I have it spelled out 1, 2, 3 here, but this is for how to find Outlook headers. You could Google anything regarding your email application of how to find the headers there. But really you could copy and paste those headers into Word or Notepad. And I'm going to show you what that looks like, but I'll have a spoiler alert for people that might be a little overwhelming on the technical side, that you could just Google some services that could parse out this information for you. But moving on to the next slide, this is an actual example of a spoofing email that came to People's United, tried to defrauding our treasury area. So this is an example of the reply to spoofing. So looking at the yellows, the yellow highlights really first in this email header. So it received, and the names are changed, but you guys could get the gist of what the message is. So Rob Blake was our customer. It appeared to come from Rob Blake, but once you look through the headers or you look at the reply to, it's actually going to this Sherry person at this weird organization that ends up being obviously completely fraud. So the way they spoofed it is it appears to look like it's coming from your customer, but obviously I'm in control of Sherry's email address. And I also have to say, don't be mad at Sherry because she's just another pawn that her email account has been compromised for a fraudster and I have access to it. So that's one of the things that when you do get into these investigations, most people are like, well, you have Sherry, you know, it's her, she has my money, go arrest her. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But also, if you look through these headers, in the top line of the blue, you see that there's an IP of that 207, which appears to be kind of local. I believe it was from Washington, but you actually have the originating IP down there. And if you look at that, it's actually coming out of Europe. So luckily, well, I guess it's a blessing and a curse. We had some fraudulent attempts at People's United, which we then did this training of how to read email headers. And our Treasury Department is really on point with it. So they were able to stop this fraud from happening. So moving down to the next slide, with the assumption that I didn't put everyone asleep on that technical dive, you could also just Google how to find email headers. And on the right, there's this website, and full disclosure, it's not a company or vendor of Pub. It's just a free service that I use often for my research. So you could just trace the email there. You could plop in that header, and you can see right here, even in red, it says this is not does not appear to be a valid email header. And then the source IP address. If you want to really be technical, you click on that link, and it'll tell you where it's coming from. But just that error in general should show you like, hey, don't trust this. And I know that this could be time consuming, and by no means am I suggesting to use it for every email, but it's not hard, and it really could save, not even exaggerating, millions of dollars just by doing this, mostly when you have those emails that are asking for some payment differences. And also just call the customer back too, but a lot of times the customer doesn't want to be bothered. You know, they expect that wire to be sent out immediately, legitimate or fraud. You know, there's always a sense of urgency. So if you can't get a hold of the customer and you have to go by an email that's being sent to you, this would be a great way to determine if that email is actually fraudulent or not. So moving on, we have DMARC. So what is this? So this is actually an email protocol that essentially prevents phishing, spoofing, and all the malicious activity we just talked about. So again, without getting too deep into technical jargon, the picture explains it all. The top row, you have the scammer who is sending the mail out through the inbox. The mail goes out without DMARC. And then DMARC, you have the scammer who then sends it to this little police officer. I'll say like a ninja Dave, right? And then he says, no, this is a fraudulent email. And then automatically sends that email to the trash. So essentially, if everyone used DMARC, then BECs would be obsolete. So if you're like me, your next question is, so why isn't this a standard? And I don't have the answer for that, but I have been campaigning a little bit for it for some years now. But nonetheless, I highly recommend that you connect with your email provider to implement this, because I know it used to be free. If there is a fee, it's again a very minimal cost for what could happen. It's definitely not $1 million. So that could help you substantially. So when people say, okay, my email's been compromised, but I changed my password, and so many times we say, but I'm still getting reports that my email is consistently sending out spam and fraud. Well, once somebody compromises your actual email account, chances are that the first plan of attack that they do is to set up rules, and it's simple rules like auto forwards, auto deletes. So, send every email received to Karen@fraud.com. Or send every email sent with an invoice in the subject to, again, my fraudulent email address. There's easy ways to just set up more complicated rules that are listed here. Like, for example, whenever an email contains the words payment or instructions, then change that information to routing ABC and account 123. Unfortunately, they can now do automated scripts and bots that you don't even have a person to have to do that anymore. They set it and forget it. So the main goal here is to really set home that the risk remains active of a compromised email account even after you change your passwords, because essentially you're still providing a read-only access to the fraudster of everything that's going through your email coming and going. So really, step one is to not only change your password, but make sure it's cleaned, check your rules, delete everything, and ensure that there's nothing more set up, because you want to stop the fraud altogether. And so again, moving on here, this is another quick reminder that you don't have to be an experienced hacker anymore to facilitate these types of scams. This was a simple Google search that I did, and GitHub came up. It's a tool for open source projects for computer coders. I will say that GitHub by any means is not fraudulent, but as you can see, there's highlighted in yellow here, there's a nice tutorial on YouTube of how to create new malicious mail rules. So you don't have to have a computer science degree to really implement these types of fraud anymore. So COVID, it's a little thing of the past. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but really a lot of the threats that have been introduced are here to stay. And so your past environment, you had everything brick and mortar. Probably most people are hybrid, had some e-commerce, but there are some businesses that really heavily relied on everything physical. Like, for example, like the cash, the receipts, your green bar reports, everything in a vault on a physical location. And you had to move now to e-commerce only in digital world. So, back to e-commerce. Know who you're doing business with. Businesses that are vulnerable and even in the past would most likely not fall for something. Now they're kind of desperate for business or desperate for supplies. That's getting better now, but it's still out there where, you might never have fallen for a scam before, and you're just taking that risk because you're trying to get back to the type of business and security that you had of financial security, of 2019. So another thing with e-commerce that a lot of people don't necessarily bring up, but are you up to date with the different privacy regulations per state? Are you protecting your customers' data? Do you have PII of your customer? Do you have transaction data? And is it being properly encrypted? Or are you leaving it exposed unknowingly? Even though it's unwitting to you, you may still be liable if there is breaches. Do you have customers in multiple states? And are you aware that each different state may have different regulations? Back to, again, home routers. So how safe is your home router? Suddenly you're using the same network, if not even the same device for your business as your son's, Fortnite addiction or your daughter's TikTok exception. And that could be really scary, because whatever they click on, unfortunately, can have a substantial impact on your business if you're using that the same router, same network, same device. So always use a VPN. I want to say that strictly, because your home router is only as strong as your weakest device on your network. So using VPN for business services with full encryption at rest and in transit. I also want to just bring up the fact that if you're using a free service, I think we all now know that if the service is free, that means that you are paying with something else, which is most likely you and your data. Always authenticate people on your network. So again, that's a zero trust, zero knowledge. Zero trust meaning that don't trust anybody on your network, even if they are your quote unquote, reputable data protection people. And zero knowledge meaning that yes, you should have a vendor or partner with them to protect your data, but that vendor should only know that they're encrypting and protecting your data and really should have no knowledge or transparency into what the data actually is. I know it's easier said than done, but I do have to bring that up. And again, with a new risk from COVID and networks again, working from home on the next slide. This is from BAI, where it was referencing of kind of the call centers that had to work from home and the exploitation that fraudsters had on them. So a little excerpt here: employees working from home, please turn their smart devices off, their home devices like Amazon, Echo, or Google. Recommends call center workers also eliminate tools like baby monitors that could provide access to their home networks. So, we have to be conscious of our surroundings, and we all heard the stories of hacked rings and hacked baby monitors. But when we're in a world where everyone's working from home, that's becoming even more lucrative. It's not just a once in a while, it's becoming a tactic of business intelligent property. So also, as of last week, Amazon released a new initiative that allows your Echo devices to automatically share your internet with your neighbors. The default of that is to opt in, and the lack of awareness or announcement from that as an anti-fraud professional is really unnerving. So please check out how to turn that off if you have Echoes in your home, since that will absolutely magnify this issue of infiltrating home networks for the purpose of facilitating business fraud. So again, phishing is nothing new here, but with the whole COVID environment, it really changed substantially. Everybody, is working in their PJs, they're letting their guard down. So just a couple examples of what we've seen. You have your meeting invite. Hi, I know I sent this with Zoom, but we're changing platforms. Please use this link instead. Oh, hey, Karen, it's Jake from IT. We have our own new internal meeting platform for the bank or for the company. Download this new software. Steve, sorry, I can't send my payment like I used to. What a crazy world. Similar to exactly the conversation phone call that Todd referenced before. My bank told me to send payments like this instead. Here's my routing number. Here's my new account number. And then, of course, you have the regular social engineering where it's like, oh, I'm from your IT department. Can I have your employee ID or last four of your social? You never know where that's going to end up. And then hiring in this COVID environment was also a new tactic or for fraud, but also just something to get used to in general, where you're hiring people you never physically met in person. And I know a lot of businesses internationally have already had this and are used to it, but there are a lot of other ones that are mostly on the small business side that are just being accustomed to virtual hiring, but also be aware of the resumes and attachments, which as you're assuming somebody would attach a resume to a job application or an email of opportunity. You never know what type of malware could be attached with that. So moving on to another fraud tactic that a lot of businesses don't really kind of talk about much, but it can be used to perpetrate the fraud that we've just went over. But this is I want to say this was back in 2018. This is from Chipotle. And just reading the part in yellow, Chipotle's human resources department has been replying to new job applicants using the domain chipotlehr.com, a website that the company has never owned or controlled. So essentially anyone could have read the email destined for this company's HR department just by registering that domain of chipotlehr.com. Luckily, a white hat hacker, so it was somebody who hacks for the good of the government in the world, noticed this and registered that and then reported it to Chipotle. But speaking of hiring, it's just commonly exploited that the fact that, excuse me, most businesses do not register all their domains or like domains, and this is an exact example of that. But I highly recommend spending that extra few bucks and time registering like domains that can be impersonated for your business. So if you're Karen.org, then you should probably spend the next couple bucks and register Karen.net and Karen.biz, because somebody else will. And here's a great example of that. This is another example of email headers of an email that was fraudulently attempted to defraud our Treasury Department. So on the headers here, you could see more clearly that that spoof domain of industry versus industries, and they were capitalizing on the fact that the business is international, and so assumed that nobody would know the difference. This, and if you look at the IPs on the header, appears that it's coming from Washington or Vancouver, Washington. But scrolling down on the next page, if you actually, and I know that this is something that I would do because I'm kind of a geek in this aspect, and for the next screen, Dave. And I don't expect everybody to really go this far into it. But if you look at who actually registered this domain of the industries, it was created, and it was just created 70 days ago. And so there's a couple things on this registration slide of that domain that was just registered that I want to bring out. So this is the actual domain registration information from that spoofed email. And so the first thing that I wanted to point out is that this fraudulent domain was registered 70 days before that email was sent. So that means that they registered it over 2 months ago prior to actually initiating the fraud. And it goes back to that step 2, that reconnaissance, where it goes to show that they were setting it up, and it took them almost 2 months before they actually sent that original email, because they're looking at the communication back and forth to try to perpetrate exactly who they're trying to mimic. And then also that this is absolute public information. So not only does it show when that domain was created, but it also shows when that domain expires. And there are several underground businesses that are in the market of registering your expiring domains before you do. So they either beat you to your own business and then they impersonate you to look as legitimate as possible, or they extort you for payment to get your own domain back. So it's public information, again, when a domain is expiring. So please just make sure that you know when your domain's expiring before somebody else does, because I guarantee, especially the larger business you are, that somebody is already waiting for you to slip up on that. So typo squatting is another very prevalent form, again, with this whole spoofing of business domains and sites. So I'm not sure, I know that if we have a different avenue of if anybody could tell the difference between these two websites, this is just a great example. So from the naked eye, it looks like call me for business, call me for business. But if you actually change the font, which is one of the prevalent tactics for fraudsters, call C-A-L-L, but I change it to C-A capital L and capital I. And in so many fonts, the letters capital I and lowercase l are the same. So naturally, these would direct you to different places, but it may not look any different to you. So same with the letter L and the number 1. So always type in the URL you're looking for, don't click. And back to registering domains, it would be smart that if you have either of these letters in your address of your domain or your email, might as well register that L, that I, or that 1 to prevent someone else from spoofing you and collecting your payments as well. And then last but not least, by any means, ransomware. There's so many people that assume that their business is not big enough to be a victim of ransomware. Yes, that most of the bigger businesses in the industries are in the news, but that's because a lot of times small businesses are afraid to really produce or should I say announce when they actually have suffered a breach. So this actually came from, I believe, January 2020 from Malwarebytes. So that was in the last 12 months. So now we're 2021. So you can imagine these numbers have changed pretty dramatically, especially the first one. So in 2019, because this again was published in 2020, 22% of small business organizations had to cease business altogether because they were a victim of ransomware. And now we already know what happened in 2020, so I can't imagine what that statistic is now. But really, update security patches, back up your data regularly, use air gaps when possible. When I say air gaps, basically, if you have a network if you're backing up your data on a network that's compromised, then your backup is going to be compromised. Have a hard drive somewhere that you're unplugging from the network, and that gap is air all around it, meaning it's physically not on the network. Really train your employees. Humans are always the weakest link. Try not to let your employees be the weakest link. Back to what Todd said, cyber insurance. A lot of times this doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Ask your insurance company who they use if you don't know who to go with. Also make sure that your rider contains BEC, ransomware, and data breach protection, because those could be 3 separate instances that you might need cyber insurance for. You want to get covered on all of them. Also make sure that PR is included in that package. It's not just monetary reimbursement. You'd like somebody to stand on your side to clear up your reputation if unfortunately that does happen to you. And just defending against the risk, again, recapping everything that we've already said. I don't know if Todd wants to jump in anymore. I know we're almost on time, but logging into your online banking, and a lot of the most banking services will always have that last login date. When you log in, ensure that you're looking at that and that it makes sense. A lot of banking services will also have a distinguished device that you can name or nickname so you know who's logging in. Also something that you should be aware of. Again, check positive pay, ACH, watch your return files, really convert as many paper to electronic, because electronic, although is somewhat more risky in different ways, has better fraud controls that on the prevention side generally. And then I know digitalization in 2020 has really made us lazier as a society, not anybody particular, of talking to people, but really get on the phone, call the people. If you call your vendors, call your customers, you're supposed to have this relationship. Don't rely on people calling you, and don't rely on emails for changing things. Phone numbers, emails, everything could be spoofed. It really has to be talking on the phone, back to that old school 80s methodology, but really that's the only way that you're going to be able to really prevent a lot of these types of fraud.
Yeah, and Karen, the only thing I would add is to your point, definitely log into your online banking platform on a regular basis. I can't tell you, again, the number of times I've received phone calls from someone to say, hey, I'm reconciling my checking account from 3 or 4 months ago, and I noticed a fraudulent check. At that point in time, it really is almost impossible to go back and recoup or rectify the situation. So I know it's not always easy when you're operating a small business to monitor your account activity daily, but if you're unable to do it daily, get in there several times a week just to make sure that you're looking at the transactions that are clearing on your account, have your account reconciled frequently. There really is no science to this. There's just, it just takes some sweat equity to really monitor your account if in fact you don't have some of the fraud prevention products in place. And that's part of the reason why you should implement fraud protection, because it really does provide you peace of mind. You may not always be out money per se, or the sum of money may be relatively nominal. It's all of the other stuff that goes along with closing your account, or getting new check stock, or providing new instructions to your vendors as to where they need to remit payment to. So the last thing you want to be doing is opening and closing a bunch of accounts, because it's a real time drain on your resources. So I know Karen provided a ton of information to digest. A lot of that information, it was really kind of new to me as well. So I think you'll see these scams continue and get more ingenious. So the more we can do to stay out in front of these fraudsters, the better off we all will be. Hey, Dave, I'll turn it back over to you, because I know you may have a different perspective from where you sit, and maybe you can provide some comments as well.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And if anyone has any specific questions right now, we have a few minutes left, so we can certainly try to address them if you want to type them into the chat here. I had just a kind of my own personal question for Karen, because since we got her here, and with her ninja skills here, I'm wondering who are these fraudsters? I mean, some of it seems like it's just very basic stuff, stealing mail, stealing check. But then we hear about these very coordinated efforts and large efforts there. It seems like very advanced. So I don't know if you can comment as to how this has evolved or who these
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, so generally you have a mix of the boots on the ground fraudsters, but now they're actually really kind of being associated to the more of an organized crime, whether it's drug cartels or other international crime in that aspect, whether it's nation states or adversaries. But unfortunately, a lot of, especially the counterfeit and the mail theft fraud, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but just factually speaking, unfortunately, they prey on drug addicts and homeless people. And they do so because either they don't care if they're going to go to jail because they might actually enjoy shelter and food, or the fact that they actually kind of hold over them as their dealer. Okay, well, you go, you cash these checks, you rob these mailboxes, and then I'll, split the profits, whether it's cash and or unfortunately controlled substance on the drug side. And they have these larger scale rings that prey on the vulnerable physically, because if they do get, if law enforcement does arrest them, then they'll either just find more, or that again their identity isn't really worth anything to. It's hard for me to say it politically correct, but they feel as if they're disposable, and I don't feel that way. But unfortunately, the leaders of these crime rings that are more on the localized aspect have a lot of layers in between, so that when somebody is obtained by law enforcement, they don't know necessarily who they're working for, so they can't exactly, there's so many layers that they could only say, okay, well, I'm just dropped off on this corner and I deposit my earnings here and I get a share, and I don't really know what's happening. And so it's designed that way. But unfortunately, then the larger you get up on the scale of these fraud rings, then that's where it gets more involved into the organized crime. So it's a very loaded question, but that's where it typically starts, unfortunately.
Thanks, Karen. I don't see any questions in the chat. I guess I just reiterate for everyone just to be super diligent, double check everything, especially when they're changing routing instructions, picking up the phone and verifying that there's the individual that is authorized to tell you that new information is in fact correct. And just monitor your accounts and take advantage of these fraud prevention services if you can at your banks. So I want to thank you, Karen, for your presentation. There was a lot of detail there, and I certainly learned something. I hope all of you have taken a few tidbits back from this presentation and kind of put those to work and become a more safer organization and protect your liquidity in your accounts. Thank you, Todd, as well, for chiming in and explaining those products for us. And Julie, thanks for the opportunity to showcase some of my team here at People's United Bank. We love to provide resources to our customers and people we haven't done business with yet. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. I put my email address in the chat box there. And I know New Hampshire SBDC will be sending out a follow-up information. Should anyone have any further follow-up questions, we'll be happy to get back to them. So Julie, I turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think the biggest takeaway is that if you think you're working hard to protect yourself, the fraudsters are working harder to take advantage of you.
I have that effect on people, Julie. I should have warned it ahead of time.
It's okay. I'm just sitting out here with my video off, sweating, like checking my bank account. But that's good. I think it's nice to have those reminders to remain vigilant. I did want to remind everyone who's on the call today, Dave shared his contact information. Keep keep an eye out for the email from SBDC, but also remember that their advisors are a free resource for you. So if you're sitting here feeling a little bit overwhelmed with this information and you want to sort of sort through and come up with a plan, just a reminder that the SBDC advisors are a resource for you. They are available. Reach out to them and continue attending these webinars. I know it's not always fun to hear. It can be a little bit intimidating, but I think making sure you're staying on top of it and remaining vigilant, protecting yourself and your company as well is really the best thing you can do. So Heidi, I know you're here with us. I don't know if you had anything to add to this, but thank you all so much. Thank you to the Peles team again.
Thank you guys. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.